Welcome in and welcome back to my channel. I'm so happy to have you here. This week we're doing something a little bit unique. I'm going to show you the behind the scenes, the step-by-step process of how I made an original watercolor for my house. I hope that by the end of this video you see that you can do this too, and watch all the way through for a special surprise at the end. Of course, we're putting some Mozart behind this time lapse because I am a classical gal. I was raised a ballerina, so I love that kind of music and it just makes me feel a little bit more elegant. But anyways, the first thing that we did here and that I always like to do is I'll draw out my flowers, which I did behind the scenes. If you can't draw it, you can always just trace something, print and trace. Hey, I'm not knocking it, do what you gotta do. But then I take a paintbrush and just whatever color that I feel like I want that flower to be, and I paint the entire flower that color in a very, very light coat. After the first coat of just putting a little bit of paint down is done, it's now time to start making the flower a little bit more 3D and give it a bit of life. So in order to do that, we need to do a little bit of shading, even as we bring out the layers of every petal. How does that happen? Well, we have to think about physics. Light will cast on an object, and whatever isn't exposed to the light will be covered in shadow. So the first thing you need to do is decide where the light source is coming from. Is it coming from the sky? Is it coming from a lamp? Is it behind, in front, or on the side of your objects? For this painting, I made it as though the light was shining kind of right on the flowers from the front, from my vantage point. And so that means every petal that's not forward on the painting needs to have a shadow cast onto it. So a good way to think of that is anytime there's a crease or where two petals meet each other, whichever one is behind should have a little bit of a shadow under it to outline it, and you will see that will make a huge difference. Now, I haven't actually added the shadows yet. I'm just starting to do that, taking that original color I used for that flower, and I build that up so that I can start to add that dimension. I hope that makes sense. One thing to keep note with watercolor is it can be a fantastic tool to give a more mature, flowy, natural look to things. It's not going to be as vibrant typically right off the back of as an acrylic or even an oil painting. And the more you water it down, the more muted it can become, which adds a really nice effect. I will say you need to be careful, especially if you're using an easel, because adding too much water will cause drips. So that's something to keep in mind. It might be better to layer things piece by piece, a little at a time, even move from one flower to the next or one piece to the next, so that you give things enough time to dry. I'm not kidding when I say I put such a light coat on these flowers that it almost looks blurry and hard to see in this video, but I always have to have a base layer. Now, if you were doing a painting where you wanted the background to be a different color, I tend to love the color of this canvas, but if you wanted a background color, I would typically advise doing that first or doing that in tandem with painting the base layer of the flowers, because it's a lot easier to go and paint over and paint the objects that are in the foreground than the background. So some painters will even do a whole wash of the background first. That's completely up to you and personal preference. I think with each medium, there's a different way to fine tune it. With watercolor, I tend to like how the background looks. With oil, I always like to paint the dark colors first. And with acrylic, I love to do a background first, a full wash, so that I can build up from there. I'm using the brown to add some shadowing, and I'm seeing where the light would cast and where shadows would form. There's not a ton of rhyme of reason to this. It's something that you build an intuition for. But if it's something that's challenging, I would suggest using a reference photo. And fun fact, I did use a reference photo to draw each one of these flowers. I love freehanding art, but I have a much better time if I have a reference that I can see the nature of it. Even if I don't use the same shapes or colors, it kind of gives me the personality of that flower, and it helps me draw it in a way that's more true to its nature. It's kind of a huge thing to expect to just sit down for an hour or two and make a complete masterpiece. Hey, I'm sure some people can do it and that's awesome, but for me, I need to take breaks so that it can be sustainable. So sometimes I'll make an art piece in a day like this one, and other times it'll take me weeks and weeks, and it's important to do it in a way that's life-giving and sustainable, and sometimes looking at it over different days and after different points in the day will cue you to different things you might have missed in the painting itself. Because I let the art dry for a little bit, I was able to come back to it completely clear and ready to be painted on again. So I was able to add some of the middle parts of the lily. I don't actually know what they're called, maybe the pollinating part, I'm not sure. But I was able to paint over the base of the lily that I've done. And then I could go back in and paint some foliage, which it's just like how jewelry can accent a person or hardware can accent a home. The foliage just adds life and vibrance and a setting to any flower that you paint. So I would always recommend having a little bit of greenery in there, or sometimes it's brown if it's something dried. Now you can get far more detailed with leaves and foliage than I tend to. I like to keep things simple. Of course, if you go out in nature, you'll see a leaf has beautiful veins and shadowing and ridges and edges that make it beautiful. But for the sake of this, and for the sake of keeping the focus mostly on the flowers, I mostly paint the leaves in a flat color, and then I'll add some shadowing and some movement, but I'm not painting every single vein. Maybe the middle vein, maybe a few here or there, but I want the flowers to be the star of the show. In case you're curious what watercolor set I'm using to paint this, I believe it's actually something meant for kids. This is not a fancy setup at all. It was a cheap easel from Michael's, I think a $30 pad of watercolor paper that's 18 by 24, and a few sets of kids watercolor paint. You don't need the most high-end supplies and products to make wonderful art. Sure, I've gotten to use some really great things in the past, but in this case, I wanted to show you that you can use everyday equipment and even some kids' supplies to make something beautiful for your home. Now, sometimes I will add a little bit of geometry here and there that isn't exactly foliage. I might add a little bit of what would look like a grass or a little twill that comes off a pumpkin. I don't actually know the right word for that, but it's like a nice little finishing touch. When I was painting these last set of leaves, I was basically running out of the green colors that I liked, so I tried to use a new color. It did come off quite neon, which I didn't love, but I knew I could easily cover it up with one of the greens I did like, and it would still look different enough in appearance from the other leaves on the painting. It's kind of funny. Like anyone, I second guess my work all the time, so I'm constantly asking my husband to come over. He has a great eye for things. He's not a painter himself, but he does a lot of other creative work. I'll say, honey, what are you seeing that I'm not seeing? Because if you're staring at something for hours on end, you're so enveloped in that world that you might miss things, and fresh eyes provide great new perspective. So my husband will come and point something out, or he'll say, hey, this doesn't translate well for me, or hey, should there be shading here? It's really cool. So if you have a friend or family member who can give you some input in an encouraging way, I would say definitely go for it. So of course at the end of painting, you'll start seeing my paintbrush go all over the canvas, and that's because I'm doing touch-ups. I might be adding depth somewhere, shading somewhere, a little bit more color where it's needed. And if you need to know whether your art is done or not, I would say take a break, just like before, take a step back. And then when you're able to return, you can see if you like the way it looks. And if you do, your art's probably done. You don't want to overwork it. And if not, a couple touch-ups might go a long way. As I'm finishing up here, of course I had to do a grand reveal, so without further ado, here are a couple clips of how the painting turned out. Alright, if you watched the video this far, I do have a special surprise for you. I will be giving away this art to a lucky one of you who's watching this video, so check out the description for all the instructions on how to enter to win this piece of art. If you liked this video, I would so appreciate if you could give it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and of course comment below. I love hearing what you think about the work that I'm doing, and I love input on what else you'd like to see. I want to keep making videos that add hope, positivity, joy, and some inspiration to your life. So on that note, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will see you in the next one. Bye now.